A troubled ally, President Bush promises no U.S. troop pullouts from South Korea. A troubled nomination, the president returns to Washington, promising to fight to the last for John Tower. This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer reporting tonight from New York. Dan Rather is covering the president's trip, and we'll hear from Dan in just a minute. Good evening. Well, President Bush is arriving home now from his first overseas trip as president. He'll have some remarks in just a moment from Andrews Air Force Base, and we'll hear them. But he arrives home as his nomination of John Tower to be Secretary of Defense is in deep trouble. And with the latest on that, we have Deborah Potter on Capitol Hill.
I hereby swear and undertake that if confirmed, during the course of my tenure as Secretary of Defense, I will not consume any beverage alcohol.
John Tower kept a low profile today, letting his extraordinary pledge to stop drinking sink in on Capitol Hill. But so far, there's little evidence that it's turning the tide in his favor.
I don't want to be cynical, but the pledge means nothing to me.
I'm leaning against the nomination based not on a single incident, but on a pattern of what appears to be bad judgment.
President Bush, still firmly backing Tower, needs the support of at least some conservative Democrats to save the nomination. Tomorrow, he'll launch a personal lobbying campaign at the White House. Among his targets, Benson of Texas, Robb of Virginia, and Lieberman of Connecticut.
And the question now for us is this one of those rare nominations that we ought to reject because we believe the person goes outside the acceptable limit?
One liberal senator, Dodd of Connecticut, also is being wooed because Tower stood up for his father, the late Senator Thomas Dodd, when he was censured by the Senate.
The relationship between my father and John Tower, while it's personally important, is not going to be the deciding factor in how I, as a United States Senator, cast my vote.
As senators trooped to a secure room in the Capitol to read the FBI report on Tower, White House aides were scrambling to hold the line among Republicans. At least two are now leaning against Tower, Kassebaum of Kansas and Pressler of South Dakota.
I am looking at this very closely. I would say I am leaning in that direction.
Tonight, Republican leaders will plot strategy at the White House with not much time to turn things around. The nomination goes to the Senate floor on Wednesday. Deborah Potter, CBS News on Capitol Hill.
And the president is off Air Force One. Vice President Ms. Cuello came to meet him. Let's hear what the president has to say.
Well, let me just say that it is great to be back home again at the conclusion of a productive and rewarding trip to Japan, China, and Korea. A trip which underscored that America is and will remain a Pacific power. There were important symbols. I'll never forget that solemn moment when we paid our nation's respect to the late Emperor of Japan, the warm and genuine handshakes between old friends in Beijing's Great Hall of the People, the opportunity for the freely elected leader of a 200-year-old nation to address the freely elected legislature of a blossoming democracy, Korea. But we laid out an important substantive course, thoughtful and candid conversations with world leaders, over 20 of them. Leaders from Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Singapore, India, Pakistan, and the Philippines. And our allies from Europe, France, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, Turkey, Germany, and Spain. And meetings, leaders from the Middle East, Egypt, Israel, and Jordan. And the presidents of Brazil, Nigeria, and Zaire. And so I return tonight pleased with the progress made toward lasting and mutually beneficial relationships with our allies and friends. Of course, differences remain. Work is yet to be done. Opening foreign markets to U.S. competition, continuing to encourage the growth of democracy and human rights, and strengthening of our alliances. But common ground was found. In Japan, we have our most important Asian ally and one of our largest trading partners. Our discussions there emphasize the responsibilities we share in the field of defense. But we also spoke of ways in which the world's strongest and most innovative economies can cooperate more closely to fuel growth, not only at home, but also in the developing world. In China, I talked with the leaders that I'd known nearly 15 years ago when I served as chief of the U.S. Liaison Office. And it is clear from my trip that China approaches its thaw with the Soviets with caution and realism. We agreed that the Soviets must be judged not by their rhetoric, but by their actions, such as whether the Soviet Union actually draws down its military forces along China's border and persists in encouraging Vietnam to completely withdraw from Cambodia. We also agreed that after Cambodia has achieved a genuine end to Vietnam's occupation, free elections should be held under a coalition government led by Prince Sihanouk, with whom I met in Beijing.
So, President Bush summing up his trip, saying he saw progress there, but citing that still some problems remain. As the president is heading back to the White House tonight, John Tower is already scheduled to be there tonight, meeting with senior White House aides and the Senate Republican leadership for a strategy session. We'll have more on all this and more news in just a moment. So President Bush is home safe. Earlier today, he delivered his first major address on foreign soil to the National Assembly of South Korea and included some tough talk on trade, and that was a topic that came up repeatedly during his 6-hour visit in Seoul. Dan Rather was with the president. Here's his report.
President Bush received a warm welcome, but behind all the smiles, serious problems are building between the two countries. Trade, perhaps the most serious. Korea's trade surplus with the United States is about $9 billion. The Democratic-controlled Congress is pressing to have it cut. Mr. Bush's first stop in Seoul was a meeting with South Korean President Roh Tae-woo. President Bush pointed out that Korea has benefited from America's open markets. In return, he asked that United States products be given more access to Korean markets.
We must expect fair access to the markets here, and I believe that President Noh understands that.
When this Korean stop was originally announced, there were no plans for President Bush to leave the airport. But Korean concern about relations with America is so great, the president was asked to address the Korean National Assembly.
Pure economic success has created concern in the management of our bilateral economic relations. Protectionism is fool's gold. Protectionism may seem to be the easy way out, but is really the quickest way down.
Korea is known as the land of the morning calm. But there is a demonstration here almost every day, and America is often the target. This afternoon, about 500 students at Dankook University marched against the Bush visit. They were heavily outnumbered by police. Seoul had been braced for big demonstrations, but a government clampdown prevented them from forming. 10,000 police were brought in. Earlier during the day, 15 leading dissidents were arrested outside the U.S. Embassy as they tried to present a letter denouncing the president. One of the Korean dissidents' demands is the withdrawal of American forces. But President Bush said today there are no plans to reduce U.S. forces in Korea. He told Koreans as long as the 42,000 U.S. troops are needed, they will remain. This fast-developing nation had enough clout that the president felt he could not go to Tokyo and Beijing without a stop here, if only for 6 hours.
As for the president's earlier stop in China, the Chinese government said today it prevented a famous dissident from going to President Bush's farewell banquet in Beijing because the United States invited him without consulting the Chinese side. Scientist Fang Li was stopped and harassed by police on his way to the dinner last night. Today, a White House spokesman said the president was not aware of what happened at the time and that later Mr. Bush expressed regret about the incident to a Chinese official. Fang Li said that he hopes the Americans say something more about it in the next few days. Legal wrangling over evidence and national security concerns prompted the judge in the Iran-Contra trial of Oliver North today to clear the courtroom and send the jury home. CBS News law correspondent Rita Braver reports.
A battle over classified documents brought the Oliver North case screeching to a temporary halt today. The dispute came during the testimony of Robert Owen, a private citizen who worked as Oliver North's bagman, shuttling money and messages between North and his secret army in Central America. North's attorney, Brendan Sullivan, was questioning Owen about a trip he made to inspect a proposed airfield site in Costa Rica. Just as Sullivan was ready to introduce a document pertaining to the trip, prosecutor John Kecker objected. The judge called all the attorneys to the bench. Administration sources say Kecker's concern was that the document included the name of a Costa Rican official whose identification could be embarrassing to him and to the U.S. government. The judge gave the jury one recess after another as he and the lawyers haggled. Finally, he sent the jurors home for the day and went into a closed court session. Administration sources say the judge ruled that the defense will be allowed to introduce the controversial document tomorrow. The government could have blocked the release of the information by dropping some of the charges against North. But the sources say the government decided to go along with the judge's order because Owen is a private citizen and the document is not official government material. Today's events, however, leave no doubt that future classified issues will not be settled so easily when it's current and former U.S. officials on the stand. Rita Braver, CBS News at the federal courthouse in Washington.
A Lebanese hijacker who found himself hijacked by U.S. agents in the Mediterranean went on trial today in Washington. The federal case is the first of its kind under a U.S. law aimed against international terrorists. Mark Phillips reports.
Fawaz Yunus here shaking hands with the people he had kept captive for 30 hours aboard a Jordanian airliner. Yunus was not a particularly notorious terrorist. The hijacking was a relatively minor one. None of the passengers, including 2 Americans, was killed or even hurt. Only the plane was blown up. Today, Fawaz Yunus sat in a Washington courtroom watching video of the hijacking. Charged with 6 counts of terrorism, he's the first person to be tried under a 1984 law targeting terrorists who attack U.S. citizens abroad.
And it doesn't matter whether Fawaz Yunus is a particularly famous terrorist, a terrorist.
And Fawaz Yunus was a terrorist who was gettable. He had left Beirut for Cyprus. He was lured to a yacht in international waters, ostensibly to make a drug deal. FBI agents were on board waiting to pounce. They pounced with enough enthusiasm to break both of Yunus's wrists. Yunus was then transferred to the USS Butte, which took 4 days to rendezvous with the carrier Saratoga. 4 days during which a confession was extracted. A confession the defense contests, saying Yunus was in pain and seasick. A transatlantic flight from the Saratoga to the U.S. was the last stage of this elaborate sting. The long arm of American justice had been flexed.
I would hope that every single terrorist out there, when offered wine, women, or song, or drugs, has to worry whether there's an FBI agent at the other end.
The defense says Yunus was a small-time operative of the Amal militia in Lebanon who was merely following orders. But the effort and expense the U.S. went through to bring Fawaz Yunus here and put him on trial has turned him into a far more important figure and turned this trial into a test case of the U.S.'s resolve and its ability to try to fight terrorism through the courts. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Washington.
Investigators looking into Friday's fatal United Airlines accident over the Pacific have recovered more than 50 pieces of debris. What they haven't found yet is what caused part of the jumbo jet's right side to rip off. Jerry Bowen is on the scene in Honolulu.
As United Airlines completed a special inspection of the cargo doors on its entire fleet of 747 jumbo jets, federal investigators focused on the possibility that a failure of the cargo door latching system led to Friday's disaster, which killed 9 passengers. Of special interest are the latch supports, which the door locks onto. In the crippled jet, those supports showed scrape marks.
We have removed one of the latch supports, and that will be further examined. We will be looking at other 747 airplanes to see what those airplanes look like and be comparing latches with other airplanes.
The damaged United jet was scheduled to have its cargo door locks reinforced under an FAA directive to all U.S. airlines. United said it's now accelerating those modifications. Over the weekend, the airline temporarily grounded a Hong Kong-bound 747 in Seattle when a cargo door could not be closed. Officials say the problem was a motor, not the lock. And some industry analysts say the real problem with these aircraft is the construction. A fuselage bonded rather than riveted together.
The skin's becoming unglued even when it's not supposed to. Just because the baggage door opened up, apparently, 40 feet of the fuselage came open with it. That's unacceptable.
Boeing officials declined comment today. Meanwhile, the black box voice and flight data recorders arrived in Washington. Investigators will see if they provide any clues as to what went wrong on United Flight 811. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Honolulu.
Even though Iran is threatening to break diplomatic relations with Britain, the British government stood firm today in defending Salman Rushdie, the author of Satanic verses. Rushdie also got support today from a handful of dissidents in Moscow protesting the silence of the Kremlin. Doug Tennell in Paris says that.
Chanting "Shame on Khomeini," a group of Soviet political activists demonstrated in Moscow today, demanding that the Ayatollah rescind his call for the murder of the author of the Satanic verses. One demonstrator was arrested. The Kremlin is treading very carefully now because Iran is offering the Soviets an unprecedented opportunity to make the most of this latest controversy with the West. Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze yesterday met at length with Ayatollah Khomeini, the first audience granted any official of a world power since the revolution 10 years ago.
Shevardnadze has got European diplomats turning green with envy, especially here in France. This was Ayatollah Khomeini's home in exile before the revolution, but the French foreign minister never even got close to the Ayatollah's home on a recent visit to Tehran. Neither did the West German foreign minister, whose country is a leader in the race for the lucrative business of rebuilding Iran.
Shevardnadze discussed Iran's plans to supply the Soviets with natural gas and the Soviet offer to build a rail link from Iran's northern border to the warm water port of Bandar Abbas. Both are huge projects, but not the first.
The majority of post-war contracts that Iran is signing up are not with the Western Bloc, they're with the Eastern Bloc.
The Soviet withdrawal from the neighboring Muslim nation of Afghanistan opened the door. In January, Khomeini hinted to Mikhail Gorbachev that Iranians feel less threatened by Soviet culture than by the decadent West.
Remember, the Soviet Union has got many tens of millions of Muslims. It's the fastest growing part of the Soviet Union.
The official atheism of the Soviet state has not been an issue for Shevardnadze in Tehran, even though some Muslims believe doing business with the Soviets is dealing with the devil. Doug Tennell, CBS News, Paris.
A team of American doctors today began an unprecedented tour of mental hospitals in the Soviet Union. Moscow correspondent Barry Peterson now with that.
This is the new Soviet propaganda line, a documentary inside a mental hospital. Officials insist there are no political prisoners here, as human rights groups allege, only the genuinely ill. Now the Soviets are allowing their claims to be put to the test. For the next 2 weeks, American psychiatrists will visit 4 mental hospitals, interview about 30 current or former patients.
Certainly those patients where we have any concern about their appropriateness of their treatment as a result of our interview will require some further follow-up and will remain on international lists of concern.
The Soviets are trying to persuade the world they no longer lock up and drug dissidents into submission. CBS News was recently given access to this facility the Soviets say is the largest mental hospital in the country. Doctors here say there are safeguards to protect patients who are medicated against their will. Nothing here has really changed, the director assured us. It's just that now we show you. The new openness, indeed the very fact that we are allowed to come to a place like this, is part of the proof the Soviets offer to say their psychiatry has gone legitimate. But doubts, deep doubts, still persist. Former patients gather weekly at a Moscow park to discuss proposed changes in Soviet law that would forbid psychiatric abuse. Alexander Podrobenik's newspaper tracks those swallowed up by the mental hospitals. His views are shared by many who have been through the system. Things have changed for the better, he says, but certainly there are still political prisoners in both prisons and mental hospitals. The American doctors promise a public report when they finish. But one former patient scoffed at Soviet claims about how deep and how lasting the changes have been. There is still a huge difference between what Mikhail Gorbachev wants, he warned, and what really exists. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
Hot tea all day doesn't stop this dentuera from hitting high C.
Hot tea? Fix-it and forget it.
Give up hot chocolate just because I started wearing dentures? Scab!
Hot chocolate? Fix-it and forget it. Heat-resistant Fix-it spreads evenly to keep on fixing loose spots, no matter how often it gets hot.
I can drink hot coffee all day and still help a lady.
baby.
Heat resistant. One more reason to use Fix-It-Ent and forget it.
You're looking at a list of foods that have more fiber per serving than prunes. Prunes, the high-fiber fruit.
This year, if you really want to get money back, listen to Henry Block.
Go to Subaru.
Get up to $1,000 back on a Subaru.
You've always trusted Woolite to care for your fine sweaters. Wouldn't you love to get that same Woolite care for your rugs and for your chairs? Well, here's how. Woolite Deep Cleaning Rug Cleaner works so well, it removes even stubborn dirt. And for chairs, Woolite Upholstery Cleaner foams away dirt safely and beautifully. Get your rugs and upholstery Woolite clean with Woolite Rug Cleaners and Upholstery Cleaner. Trust Woolite care for rugs and chairs.
The announcement came on Saturday night. The Dallas Cowboys were being sold for an estimated $140 million, and with the new owner was coming a new head coach. Well, that means the end of the trail for the man who for 3 turbulent decades shaped what came to be called America's team. Bob McNamara tonight looks at the legacy of a legend.
He was back in the saddle again. Tom Landry, back with the Cowboys this morning, only this time for goodbyes. A player minicamp went as scheduled. Life after Landry would go on.
No, I'm not bitter. That's just my nature is not to be bitter.
This is KLIF. Let's go to Phil in North Dallas.
But even today in Dallas, Landry's Saturday firing was still topic one.
30 years here. I mean, my God, he took this club from nowhere to 2 consecutive decades of winning. There's never been a streak like that in the National Football League before.
Old Cowboys were at a loss, too.
He's an institution, he's a legend, and I just think that it should have been handled differently.
It hasn't sunk in yet. It's going to be a long time before it does.
If my voice cracks, this is Christmas to me.
It was Arkansas oil man Jerry Jones who bought the Cowboys from financially strapped Bum Bright. And with Jones comes old college teammate Jimmy Johnson, the University of Miami coach to succeed Landry. Hairspray and histrionics replacing the hat on the Cowboys sidelines.
I think right now they could have done it a lot better, obviously, but, they were excited.
Well, I'm sure that he feels now that all those cold times that when he released players or when there wasn't very much communication between management and players, I'm sure that he now feels what it's like.
For as long as they've been the Cowboys, Tom Landry was coach.
Well, the Cowboys need a miracle. Roger takes the snap, pumps it once.
And though his team grew to glamour as the model for all NFL franchises,
Pearson makes the catch at the 5, touchdown!
Landry teams of late stumbled through 3 losing seasons, and fans soured and snored.
When it's all over with, the things you're going to remember are not the Super Bowls. You're going to remember the players. You're going to remember the situations that you went through.
Landry left his team where he got them, at the bottom of the standings. Still, there's a campaign now to name Texas Stadium after the man who once packed it. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Dallas.
And that's the news. I'm Bob Schieffer. Dan Rather will be back here at the home base tomorrow night. Good night.
I'm Harry Smith.
And I'm Kathleen Sullivan. Tomorrow, Billy Packer and Brett Musburger talk college basketball.
Also, Connie Selica joins us on CBS This Morning.
This is CBS.